Good evening, everybody. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So said the great philosopher George Santayana back in 1905 in his book, The Life of Reason, part of a series on great ideas of Western man. It's not just because the quote itself is so sound that I wanted to start off this evening with that, but also because it ties in with our topic tonight and with our guest. The interwoven woke social justice, critical race theory, anti-racism movement of our day seems determined to wipe out America's and Western civilization's past. We used to refer to Western civilization as Christendom. If that movement succeeds, we shall indeed be condemned to repeat history, complete with its nearly universal evils of slavery, oppressive aristocracy, racial rivalry, and ill treatment of women. On our program this evening, we have a special guest, John Hodges, director of the Center for Western Studies, who will discuss how he is working to help young people remember the past so they can help America not to have to repeat it. So welcome to From the Stacks. This is a program of the coalition, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We're a network of just under 70 evangelical Christian scholars, scientists, economists, theologians, and philosophers committed to educating the public and policymakers about three things simultaneously and interwoven. The first is biblical earth stewardship, or what we call godly dominion. That is, that we are supposed to multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it in a manner that glorifies God. Our calling is to enhance the fruitfulness, the beauty, and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. The second area of our task is to educate regarding economic development for the very poor. That is, we're looking for the things that lift not individuals or a few families here and there out of poverty, but the things that lift and keep whole societies out of poverty. We find those to be two things, really. The first, a set of 5 social institutions. Those are private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. The second is access to one particular material, or we might say energetic thing, and that is abundant, affordable, reliable energy. These two things are indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty, and that's why we want to make sure that people understand about them. And then the third area is the gospel of Jesus Christ, together with the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that come along with it. And that's important because if we don't follow the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the Logos of God, the God who in his infinite wisdom designed a universe to be understood by people made in his image so that we can use it in ways that are productive, that are good rather than evil or simply wasted. If we don't understand that, if we don't learn to think God's thoughts after him, we're not going to make good use of this world. We're not going to be good stewards of it. And people need to be reconciled to God from our naturally sinful condition if we are, in fact, going to be able to learn to think God's thoughts after him. So these are all things that the Cornwall Alliance is dedicated to doing. And we every month we offer some particular resource, a book, a DVD, printed study, something of that sort, as our way of saying thanks when someone gives a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size. This month, here we are on June 1st, the very first day of the month, we're offering this book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, by my friend Jim Hollingsworth. this is an extraordinary book in that it's 48 chapters, average just about 2 or 3 pages apiece, and they are very clearly and simply written. The one of the key things about this is that anyone with, say, a 10th grade education or above can read this and understand it, and ha- having mastered these short chapters will have a firm grasp on the basics of climate science and of climate change and energy policy and the scientific and economic and engineering and other aspects of all of those. So, to request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you're filling out the donation form, in the comments section, just write in promo code 21-06 or the title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, and we will be glad to send you this absolutely free. And remember, your donation will be 100% tax deductible. So I hope that you will act on that, get a copy soon, and share it especially with young students who face, unfortunately, a lot of climate change propaganda in school pretty much every day. Now, let's move on to our special guest this evening and our topic of discussion. We'll be going into talking about social justice and the woke critical justice, critical race theory, critical legal theory movement that has become so widespread in America over recent years. And we're going to start off, though, talking a little bit about the particular ministry of my good friend, very dear friend, John Hodges. John heads up the Center for Western Studies, and we want to give plenty of time just to let people know about that. My own youngest daughter went through it, and it changed her life very much for the better. And we all look back on that time with great joy and gratitude. So, welcome, John. Thanks for joining us this evening.
My great pleasure, Cal. Glad to be here. And I'm glad to know about Hollingsworth's book. I want to get a copy of that.
Well, thank you. Well, John, explain for us, please, your own background. You haven't done the Center for Western Studies forever. I think it's what, about a decade old or so. Tell
13
us about
years
your
now.
background. It's pretty multifaceted, involving music and philosophy and art history and more. How'd you get to where you are?
Well, it's a long story. My background is in orchestral conducting. I'm a conductor by trade, opera and orchestral conducting. And I became a Christian while I was doing my graduate work in that field. And when I became a believer, I started thinking I'm going to have to make some kind of connections between my love of music and my understanding of who God is and what His plan is for my life. So it led me into a lot of thought about aesthetics and philosophy in general, about the beauty of music and why it's important, and that led me to how beauty works within God's economy. And so, for the last, I don't know, 35 years or so, I've been seriously interested in the philosophy of aesthetics, and how it is that music works, and then it spread into art history. So there's so many parallels between music history and art history that it was natural for me to lead to that. And then I started teaching college. I was the associate professor of the arts at Crichton College many years ago, and so I taught art history and music history and philosophy of the Christian faith there. But then all the while I was conducting orchestras and doing church music and composing some and that sort of thing. And eventually, when that college fell apart and closed up, the program that we put together there, this sort of team taught humanities program, had been so influential and effective, I thought, with our students, that we thought, well, maybe we could continue to do some of that work in some other capacity, and that's how the Center for Western Studies got started. We thought, well, we can't do a 4-year degree, but we could do a gap year program for kids who want to take a year off between high school and college to study the intersection of faith and the arts, faith and culture. So we teach two things. We teach a Christian view of the world and the history of Western ideas as understood through the literature and the music and the architecture and the painting and sculpture and a bit of philosophy too of the Western world.
Yeah, John is not only the leader of the Center for Western Studies and my good friend. We just discovered yesterday, for example, uh, that that we both are admirers of Edmund Burke's wonderful book on the sublime and the beautiful. We were together
Yes.
for Memorial Day and had a great time with that. Um, so John is not only doing that, he has also written a new musical, and that is on its way to being produced on stage and possibly even going to Broadway. So that's
Whoa,
pretty
well,
exciting.
hold on a second. We're not quite ready for that yet, but we do have a reading set. We're scheduling a reading for it in New York with some interested supporters. That's a
Yeah,
long way
but you
from being
told me
Broadway.
Yeah, but you told me what the path is that could get it to Broadway, and I think that's pretty
Yeah,
exciting, even to have something just starting down that path. John's also
thanks.
a symphony conductor, very experienced symphony conductor. He studied for a time under the late Leonard Bernstein, one of the most famous and gifted of American conductors. So he's just a man of many talents and many interests as well. Um,
You're kind.
I'd like for you, John, just to briefly explain what the Center for Western Studies is all about. What's the aim there? What do you want your students to come away with in terms of having their minds and their lives changed and matured?
Well, as you know, Western civilization is getting short shrift in the university and the academy these days. A lot of schools are even consciously choosing to get rid of works in their canon in their core curriculum because specifically because they are Western, as though there's something about Western civilization that is inherently evil and awful and needs to be thrown out. Well, it seems to me that the, the the Western civilization is the place for all of its faults, for all of its flaws, as a civilization. It's the place where more Christian influence has dug deeper, has grounded itself more deeply in the soil of this civilization than any other. We go all the way back to Acts 16, I think, where Paul makes the decision to go west instead of east. If you remember, he wants
Yes.
to go east on his second missionary journey, and he's stopped twice by God, directly by God. We doesn't say how exactly, but he is stopped, and when he is, he gets this dream to move to come to Macedonia, and he was in Troas at the time, and that means he had to go west. So his second missionary journey continues west into Macedonia, and then to Greece and Corinth in the end, and then back home again. And from that point on in Troas, where he has that dream, he never talks about going east again. And I think that the combination of the Jewish, we talk about Western civilization being the combination of Athens and Jerusalem, but I think it's more than that. I think it's Athens and Jerusalem represented in one man, and that one man is Paul, who was
Hmm.
both a thoroughgoing Jew and well versed in Greek thought and rhetoric. So he was prepared long before he was given the task of being the apostle that took the gospel to the West, to the Gentiles. He was prepared by God long before that, even before his conversion, to be able to be the perfect tool to take the gospel by way of the Roman roads into the Western world. And the influence then of Christianity on Rome and thus on the rest of the world over the next 2,000 years is profound. And the extension of that influence from the West into the colonies in North America, South America, Africa, and even now still working in Asia and other places. It's the oldest part of that influence, it seems to me, in the world. It comes out of the Middle East, but then it goes west. So Western civilization, to begin with, is something that is important to convey, so that we know kind of where it all started, how it all began, and where our roots are. But on top of that, I think it's our civilization. It's the one we've been born into. And wherever you're born, I think you need to get to know your family. And so we argue that it's a very important thing for young people to have an understanding of Western civilization for all of its flaws, all of its pros and cons. It's certainly not flawed. I mean, it's not flawless. But it's essential that we know that before we can even go about appreciating other people's cultures. So that's what we're after, to get a Christian view of the world and to get that view through the arts, not simply through theology, although theology is at the core of all that we do, but through the medium of music and medium of poetry, literature, and so on, so that we get the embodiment of the theology in the physical world.
Yeah. Now, would you say, though, that students who were not born into Western civilization, students who have immigrated, for instance, to America from Asia, from Africa, would be able to gain a lot? How would this benefit them?
Well, I would say that the connection to the faith is essential, but I don't equate Western civilization with the Christian faith, of course. But I was saying that it's the place where the faith has dug in the deepest. And I think any human being, because of the fact that we believe as Christians that every human being is made in the image of God and has significance and dignity, those kinds of Christian principles that turn into assumptions in all of the university studies that we've had over the last 1,500 years, like anthropology or theology or philosophy or history or any of these other things. There are an awful lot of subjects that are influenced directly by what it is that the Bible teaches about who we are as human beings, why we're here, what we're here for, what's a moral compass look like, all those things. And so any of that would be beneficial to any human being. It's not unique to people born here. It's unique to the human population in general.
Well, and it seems to me that it would be a great way for someone who has recently moved into Western civilization to become more acquainted with it, to become fairly acquainted with their new home pretty quickly. I would just see this as a very valuable experience for people who have moved to the United States or Europe or any place in Western civilization, to get a grasp of what that civilization is all about. Well, you have, John, on your website, which is centerws.com. For all of those folks out there, I would really urge you to visit centerws.com. John, you have on your website a video that kind of tells the basic story, and I've found it to be really helpful to see that. So I've arranged for our producer, Jim Moline, to show that video for our viewers right now.
Oh, great.
The world is in conflict. Has there ever been a time when it was not? Not since the garden. But each generation has its own conflicts to address, and ours are great. Our cultural organizations have turned their backs on their own purposes and histories. Our universities, were once bastions of truth but now teach there is no truth. Doctors who once swore an oath to preserve life now provide abortion. Our political leaders, once lauded around the world as statesmen, are now infamous for self-interest and compromise. The great cathedrals, once beacons of light, are more museums now than places of worship. And our art, in all its meaningless amplification, reflects only the degradation of our humanity. We have come to doubt that our own traditions, history, and heritage have anything of worth to teach us, so we have turned our backs on our own civilization. To some degree, this is understandable, since in the last 3 centuries we have departed from the approach and beliefs that we held for millennia before. For the longest time we understood that our minds, as great as they are, cannot see far enough to know all that we need to know, to make good decisions and to live the good life. Socrates saw this, the New Testament writers certainly did, and many others. But another way of thinking rose up in the West recently, one that argued that mankind could make sense of things on his own, apart from any need for transcendent truth. And from seeds planted by Enlightenment thinkers, a tree grew that overshadowed all the others. This tree taught only of an optimistic future and considered all the past misguided at best and superstitious at worst. Today, the optimism of the modern Enlightenment has failed, and radical skepticism has invaded our culture's thoughts. Of course, doubting the pre-Enlightenment approach, but now even doubting the ideas of the Enlightenment itself. The prevailing thought in the universities today is a general disbelief in any overarching theory. Any way of thinking that claims to give meaning is doubted. And the only thing left is individual autonomy, each man doing what is right in his own eyes. Without a core communal belief, our culture, like that of ancient Rome, flounders and becomes ripe for external invasion and internal chaos. Darkness is closing on our civilization. But all is not lost. God's light is most clearly seen in dark places. We can yet pray. We can recognize that cultures indeed decline. We can call on the wisdom of our ancestors by reading the great books, music, art, and architecture that they made for the express purpose of passing on the truth to us. How can we teach these important things again to the present and to the next generation so that they will know when, how, and where to confront the evils of their days? What if we could find college professors who still taught the great books in the old ways and put them with interested students of all ages? The voices of history's greatest minds can still be heard. The weight of history's greatest art can still be felt. The significance of the ideas of the good, the true, and the beautiful that have shaped the West can still be engaged, embraced, and proclaimed without apology. And it is toward this end that we work at the Center for Western Studies.
Okay, so there you go. That's I find that fascinating, and I know that our daughter, who went through the Center for Western Studies Gap Year program, benefited enormously from it. Uh, now, John, you have a number of other faculty members in addition to yourself. I had intended for us to give you some time to introduce them, but we're kind of running against the clock here, so I'm going to skip over that. I can just simply say to folks, these are really, really fascinating people, and they are They're folks who just really get into the students' lives, into the students' hearts, in a way that's very unusual in higher education, and so I would really recommend that. Now, John, I understand that your schedule is really full for the 2021 through 2022 academic
Right.
year. So at this point, you're not looking for students to start this fall. Instead, you're looking for students to start in the fall of 2022. Now,
That's right.
one of the things that I consider so valuable about the Center for Western Studies is the very close relationship between students and faculty. How many students would you prefer to have each year? And what is the faculty to student ratio if you get that? And why is that important?
Well, there are 6 of us on the faculty, and we have a kind of an unofficial limit that we're putting on the number of students that we would take at 8. Uh, we want it to be a very small program, but we've never even had 8. We've only had the maximum we've ever had was 5 at a time. So it's a tutorial program, and we want to have a lot of one-on-one and small group kind of interaction with everybody. We feel like that does a better job of solidifying some of the ideas that we want them to be able to get. So the ratio is almost 1-to-1 of faculty to students. They have to see me all the time. They don't get to see every faculty member every week by any means. They do
Okay.
they do lectures and come in on discussions every week when they can. But we have different faculty members doing a lecture each week for the students.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's me, but a lot of times it's the other 5. And we cover the ground of literature. 2 or 3 of them are PhDs in literature. We've got one guy who is a PhD in political history, so he does our Plato and Burke lectures and Rousseau and people like that. Then we have a theologian too, a pastor who does work with literature too, because he's a literary fellow as well. But he talks about the Reformation and theology in general, but the Reformation in particular, and about Luther and Calvin. In particular, Luther and Erasmus's debates about free will and some other things.
Yeah.
Who am I leaving out? Oh, we've got one guy who is just working on his PhD now in critical theory, literary theory, and so he's up on the latest academic stuff in this whole critical theory talk, critical race theory, critical biology theory, critical law theory, all of that sort of thing is happening right now, as you know, and he's sort of in the midst of that, and I'm so glad to have him there because he's a very sharp young man. But that's kind of covers our faculty. What's that?
Yeah, your website describes the center as an experiment in education intended to offer a Christian view of the world and a study of the ideas that shaped Western civilization. Does that suggest that everything about Western civilization is Christian? Why tie those two together?
Well, for the reason I said a minute ago, that no, of course not. There's plenty of Western. If you think of it this way, Western civilization is a much larger thing than the Christian influence within it. I mean, Western civilization includes the ancient Greeks, the pre-Christian Greeks, the North Africans, the writings of some of the barbarian tribes in the West. I mean, Beowulf, for example. But it's the place where Christianity has had the deepest influence over the longest period of time. And so that's why we sort of put those two things together. It's not that Western civilization is Christian. In fact, what we try to do is read extensively in the Western canon and call it, in a sense, to account in light of a Christian view of the world. So we're taking the Bible and the Christian worldview and using it as a lens through which to look at all of these works that we're talking about.
Yeah, and so you are really testing all things, holding fast what is good. You're attempting to help your students to learn how to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. That's a
That's
very
right.
exciting thing to watch. I've had the opportunity to lecture for you a couple of times and to sit in
Yes.
on some of your lengthy discussions, and that's been really enriching, rewarding to me as a Christian believer. You described the education there as tutorial. You mentioned that a
Right.
couple of minutes ago. Why is it significant that this is tutorial education?
Well, it occurs to me that when Jesus, who is the great teacher, had an opportunity to teach in the world, he chose a very small number to spend most of his time on. And rather than having lots and lots of students get a superficial take on the material that we're doing, we decided it'd be better to have a longer exposure to a very small number of people, students. And that made it possible, too, for us to be a little, I don't know, selective with who it is that we asked to come and study with us. I remember Roger Scruton saying one time in one of his books that most educational endeavors assume that they are a business offering a material in the sense of an education to a client, and the client is the student. And he says that's a bad model, and I agree with him completely. If there's a client that we here at the Center for Western Studies owe our allegiance to, our concern for, it's to wisdom. Our client is wisdom, so we're looking for students, choosing students to bring into contact with what we have seen on the faculty. We have seen, we believe, to be the wisdom of the West, and we want to preserve that wisdom. And we know that we aren't going to be around forever. All of us are going to be gone in a few decades, and they are going to have the responsibility for carrying on the Western traditions to their children or to their students. And we want to be sure that we pass it on carefully to them. So that's why we want to do a careful and carefully chosen small group of students each year. They get a chance to hear a lecture from one of the faculty each week. They get a long discussion time once every week where I or as many of the other faculty that can join me come and discuss amongst ourselves and probe them about what they're getting out of their lectures. And they also have a one-on-one time with one of the faculty each week as well, where we probe them to be sure in a kind of oral exam way that they're getting what we're trying to offer through these lectures, and that we trace down tangential elements, talk about questions that they have, and they write papers for us on the various details that we're interested in their getting. We can, with a tutorial program like that, we can tailor the thing to a great degree to the needs of each individual student. So that's kind of why we do the tutorial model. It's loosely based on the kind of Oxford-Cambridge model where you get a tutor, and that tutor assigns you to various lectures that he thinks you need to have in order to fill in the holes that you need. And then you write for him, you write your papers for him and bring them in. I usually have my students read me their papers out loud, and we talk about them as they go, which is another thing I learned from the Oxford Cambridge kind of tutorial. But that's why we do it that way.
All right, great. We have a couple of comments on Facebook that I'd like to have you respond to, John.
Okay.
The first one comes from Guy Takamatsu. He says, does Professor Hodges know of the late Donald Keene's book, The Japanese Discovery of Europe, That book argues that Western studies played a part in Japan's rapid modernization after ending its closed country policy. During the period of closed country, Japan had a group of Dutch, that is Western, studies scholars who read Western books translated into Chinese writing. But that policy was not enough for Japan to keep up with the West technologically. Some Japanese had to sneak out of the country to study in the West. In more modern times, a visiting professor with a classics background was asked by Fudan University in China to come up with a curriculum on Western studies. That's discussed in the book Full Circle by Ruth Hayhoe. It seems that outsiders seem to appreciate Western learning better than we do in the West. Your thoughts, John?
There's a lot of truth there. I think you see it in India, you see it in China, you see it in Japan over the last few centuries. Certainly right. That what do we say? What do we? Familiarity breeds contempt. Isn't that what the phrase is? Sometimes people who have taken their own lives for granted for their whole lives have very little appreciation for what it is that they've grown, that they've been handed, the culture they've been handed. Yes, it's fascinating to see the influence of Western thinking on Japan and on China through missionaries, often Jesuits in gee whiz, it was the maybe 15th century or even maybe 16th century in Japan that initially brought some of a Western thought there, and it was as late as maybe the 19th century that Japanese art and culture and so on made an appearance in Western Europe. In London, I think it's, if I remember my dates right, it's 1852 that the first Japanese art was seen in a museum, a kind of an exposition in London. And in the next decade, it was in France. And that's where a lot of the Impressionists got their influence from Japanese work. So the Japanese stuff has influenced us too.
Right.
But I'd love to read that book. That sounds like a great book.
Yeah. It reminds me of the book, The Economic Transformation of Taiwan, by Kuo Ting Li, who was a Christian and the finance minister of Taiwan in its first couple of decades after it separated from China. And Li pointed out that what enabled Taiwan to develop economically very, very rapidly was that it had embraced especially the moral values of Western civilization, which were derived primarily from the moral values taught by Christianity. Li goes into considerable length describing the history of how that happened. Later on, the Japanese did the same thing, or rather, it was earlier that the Japanese first did it, and then they did it again following World War II. And China has done similar things. It's really been amazing how much the Christian moral philosophy has shaped parts of the world in which Christianity is very much in the minority, as distinct from what it has been through much of the history of Western civilization. Now, we also have a comment from Fred Pursley, who says, I love this concept and try to use it in the homeschool co-op I teach in. I teach American history and logic, trying to observe it from a Christian worldview, pointing out the flaws, we are all sinners, and the triumphs, that is the biblical applications. And Fred, I would really urge you to visit the website of the Center for Western Studies and make your students familiar with it. This is a great sort of a capstone to homeschooling. That's what it was for our daughter, and that's what it is I've seen for many students who've gone on to the Center for Western Studies. Well, at this point, I want us to just run down very, very quickly through actually fewer than half of the major texts that students study in their academic year at the Center for Western Studies. For each one of them, John, tell us in no more than 60 seconds apiece, which is a challenge, why it's included and what it contributes to students' understanding. You start
Whew,
with
boy.
C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man.
Okay, okay. That's a challenge there, Cal. 60 seconds, huh? Okay. Well, I mean, you could spend the rest of the time we've got talking about any one of these books. We do the Abolition of Man at the very beginning of the year, every year, mainly for two reasons. I think there are two things in there, gosh, maybe three now that I think about it. He has a great description early on that beauty is a larger concept than simply personal preference. I'm not going to go into it. You
Yeah.
look into it, the first part of it. Second thing is he talks at length about the idea of the ordo amoris, an idea that he gets from Augustine. But the ordo amoris is the ordering of our loves. And I teach them that education is really not about learning facts. Education is about ordering your loves, ordering your sensibilities so that you learn to love things to the degree and to the intensity that they deserve to be loved. And so really you're getting God's view of all the things that you're thinking about and then putting them in proper order, God first and then everything else.
Okay.
So the Ordo Amoris, and that's sort of a theme for the entire year of our studies. And then there's a third element, and that is in the last chapter, third chapter of the book, he talks about how it is that when human beings cut themselves off from God and attempt to conquer nature, what happens actually is that they become slaves to their own appetites, and nature therefore conquers them. And that's
Yeah.
the entire modernist perspective, I think, in a nutshell. And if you've read the third of the Space trilogy, you've seen it fleshed out. He does a great job there.
Yeah.
How did I do?
One of my
That's it.
favorite books, and in fact, the editor Mortimer Adler, the editor of Britannica's Great Books series,
Yeah.
actually
Yes.
wanted to have The Abolition of Man added to the Great Books series,
No
but I
kidding.
guess he died or retired or something before he was able to have that done, and Britannica never followed through with it.
That's a
But
shame.
it was an amazing testimony to the greatness of that small book. Well,
Yes.
next,
Yes.
Homer's Odyssey. What about that
Right.
one?
Well, here, if you ever ask why it is that we talk about, do we talk about more than just simply Christianity in the West? Well, and here's a perfect example. Homer's Odyssey is an essential book for the understanding of Western civilization. Um, there are loads of things we could say about it. It describes the notion of what it means to be, for the Greeks, what it meant to be a virtuous man, and it serves as a kind of a Bible for the civilization of the Greeks at the time. And so we try and teach that there are things in there that are actually in line with Christianity, even though they didn't have any knowledge of Christianity. This is written 700 years before Christ, so obviously it didn't have any influence there. But but our general revelation, our general common grace, if you want to think of it that way, is revealed in a lot of the great works of the Greeks. We read the Odyssey, we read Aeschylus, we read Plato and Aristotle and some others. But the Odyssey in particular becomes a kind of a Bible for the people. And it shows how important it is for a people to have a literary foundation, something that they all have in common, like our Western canon should be for our civilization.
Another one I want you to talk about is a more recent book. This is Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity.
Oh yeah, yeah. Stark, was not a believer when he started writing about this, and then he became converted to Christianity as he wrote. But what he was writing about was the influence of Christianity on the old classical world, and we think that his understanding of the history and his understanding of the classical world is so essential. But it's also really wonderful for them to see a modern writer be so clearly influenced by what he found about the historic faith that he converts to it himself.
Augustine, one of the greatest minds of all mankind, of all history, began or pretty close to the beginning of his Confessions, was his saying, "Our hearts are restless, and they will not rest until they find their rest in thee." Addressing
Yes.
God, of course. And in fact, the entirety of his Confessions is written as prayer. And yet it's also, in many respects, an autobiography. It's one of my favorite writings of all church history. What makes it so special, John, and what role does it play in the center's education?
Well, it's a priceless book, and Augustine is truly a pillar of Western civilization, the Western Church in particular, influencing not only the Roman Catholics but the Protestant reformers as well, profoundly. I mean, Luther was an Augustinian monk, but
Yeah.
we feel like we need to know Augustine, and we don't have time to read City of God. We can only fit so many things in. So, as much as I'd like them to read City of God too, this gives them the personal touch of the conversion of Augustine himself, as well as you well know, at the end of it, the last 2 or 3 chapters, he talks about some pretty darn profound theological things. Not just during the autobiographical part, he talks about the various heresies that were present in his day. He talks about his own conversion, how he came to conversion, understand better his take on the nature of the sinful man, our depravity. But also at the end, he talks about things like the creation and time and memory, all sorts of things that are foundational philosophical ideas that had a huge influence on not just the theologians that followed him, but the philosophers that followed him. That's why we read
Yeah.
Augustine.
And Augustine writes with wonderful candor and often with just delightful humor, often self-deprecating humor.
Yes,
I
true.
have great memories, particularly of his discussions of the topics of memory and time. It's
Yes.
particularly fun to see him grappling with how can we trust anything from memory when we know that sometimes we make mistakes in our memory, and then we check up and find that we made those mistakes. But then later on, how do we know that the memory of finding that that was a mistake wasn't a mistake? That we're not mistaken in that
Right.
memory. Or his discussion of time is brilliant philosophically. It's one of the most amazing philosophical attempts to define time and to understand how time passes and how it affects us and so on. And yet, in the midst of that whole thing, he just simply confesses that he really doesn't know what time is. Uh, if
Yep.
if he's sitting back, not really trying to think about time, he understands it. But as soon as he really tries to grapple with what it is, he's lost completely. I just love Augustine. Well, another of your key texts is Dante's Inferno, part of the Divine Comedy.
Right.
Why the Inferno? Not
Yeah.
just at all, but as which one? One of the parts of the Divine Comedy.
Well, it's um, it's the most fun. All if we had time to read the entire comedy, we would. But if we have to choose one piece, we wanted them to get the Inferno under their belts. We have a joke at the center that everything comes back to Dante. Even Homer comes back to Dante. Um, it's such a seminal work for uh, theology and understanding of the spiritual walk of human beings, because it's not intended to be a picture of actual hell. It's intended to be a dramatic poem about the the walk of the spirit, the walk of the soul under God's tutelage, and that's what Dante himself is going through with the guidance of Virgil in that first book. I could talk about it all night, and I shouldn't. If you get me going on it, I'll start digging into
Yeah, well,
details and have time for that. But it's
you
I'm
referred to,
really grateful to Anthony Esselin. Tony Esselin did the translation that we use, and I just love that. And
yeah.
I hope he hears this because he really has done a great job.
Well, you referred to how much fun it is to read the Inferno. I mean, you think of the descriptions in it of the
Yes.
particular punishments allotted to particular people, very, very carefully fitted to them and what they deserve.
That,
And often it
that's
is precisely that they are forced to spend the rest of eternity getting exactly what they wanted, and they
mm.
discover how awful it is. Well, we'll
As
move on
and as
now
you
to,
descend, let me just say one more thing about it. As you descend
go
into
ahead.
hell, you become more and more intensely aware that the will is involved in sinning, the will and reason. To
Yes.
begin with, the first few layers of hell are full of people who are just blown about by the winds of their emotions or their appetites or something like that, and they're not given the kind of intensity of punishment. Bad enough, but as you get further and further down, you enter into the engagement of not just the body or the appetites, but the will, and you see people choosing to do evil, see people calculatingly doing evil, and at the very bottom of it all is the worst sin that you can possibly do in Dante's mind. I always thought that, well, that must be murder. No, murderers are way up there compared to this thing. This is betrayal. Betrayal is the worst thing that you can do. And then betrayal of your benefactor. And then, of course, in the end, Judas's betrayal of God himself. And Satan at the
Yeah.
very bottom, the one who betrayed the God. So it's a beautiful picture and a profound picture of what sin is and how it works and how sin actually results, I think, sometimes in our the punishments that come from it, like you were just saying.
Yeah.
Getting what you want is not always a good idea.
For sure. Well, of course, the greatest English writer of all time, most people agree, was Shakespeare. And you have your students reading Shakespeare's Hamlet and going into
Right.
considerable discussion of that. I think often you actually have a group of people come together, more than just the students, and take on these roles and read through the play together with a little bit of acting, not a whole lot. Uh, Tell me, why did you choose Hamlet out of all of Shakespeare's works, and what is the relevance of Hamlet to Western civilization itself?
Yeah, very good. First of all, we do a lot more than Hamlet. We usually read King Lear and A Midsummer Night's Dream and maybe Twelfth Night and Hamlet and sometimes Macbeth. We have a number of Shakespeare plays that we read, but Hamlet is the greatest of them all. I'm convinced, and that is precisely because it's the first, what I think of as the first modern day tragedy. That is a tragedy that happened. It's called the tragedy of Hamlet, but it's a different kind of tragedy than has been handed to Shakespeare. The Greek tragedies, Oedipus, and some of the other great Sophoclean tragedies, um, uh, are the story of a great man who falls because of his flaw, his pride, his overweening pride, his hubris. And Shakespeare takes that idea of tragedy and he works it into many of his plays. I mean, Lear is a great example of that kind of tragedy, Othello, Macbeth. But Hamlet is different. Hamlet is about a man who is indecisive. He can't decide which way he wants to go. And it comes Shakespeare wrote that play, started in 1599, and 1599 is the very end of the 16th century, the 16th century that brought the Protestant Reformation to Europe. Excuse me. And Hamlet, I think, is a great example as a character representing the European man at the end of the 16th century. Knowing that up until the Reformation, there was one spiritual authority in the West, the church, the Roman church, and now there are two. In fact, you could say more than two, because immediately after Luther's Reformation, things split into varying denominations, don't they, within the next 50 years or so. So suddenly the sort of stranglehold, if you want to think of it that way, the profound hold that the Roman Church had on authority and the understanding of human beings and their purpose and the next life and all that stuff falls apart, and we don't know which way to go. I mean, the history of England is all through that 16th century is a going back and forth between a monarch that's in favor of the Catholics and then a monarch that's in favor of the Protestants, and each attacking and giving all sorts of horrors to the other side, and so on.
Yeah.
So when Shakespeare writes Hamlet, I think he's writing about somebody who is in a quandary. He doesn't know which way to go, and he can't. For 4 acts, he can't decide what he should be doing. Sometimes he acts rashly and kills the wrong person. Sometimes he doesn't act at all and loses the opportunity, and so on and so on. We could go into all the details of it. But in the 5th act, in the end of the 4th act, you find something that happens that's astonishing, and it changes his mind. So in the 5th act, Hamlet is a different person, and he recognizes that Providence had control of all the circumstances the whole time, and he trusts in Providence, and then the play ends. So it ends with him dying, of course, but it ends with putting everything right in the kingdom. And so it's a picture of a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that comes, excuse me, my dog is barking at somebody. It's a tragedy that comes at the end of a hard, long process of figuring out who God is and what he's all about and how we fit into his plans. The thing that happens to him, of course, is that he's taken off to England, and he comes across pirates who save his life and bring him back to Denmark. And they just came out of the blue. And I think Shakespeare wasn't just being foolish. He wasn't writing badly. He was writing to show providential involvement. And then from that point on, you hear Hamlet saying things like, "Come what may, God knows the fall of every sparrow. If it's for me to die now, I'll die now. If I'm not going to die now, I'll die later. I'm at peace with it all." And that's a uniquely different kind of approach to things, and hopefully a solution to the disagreements about spiritual authority in Europe. Excuse me. But Hamlet is a tremendous play on a whole lot of different levels. That's just one of them.
All right, John. I said a maximum of 60 seconds per title. And we're kind of moving over that a little bit. We do have another comment on Facebook. This is from Doris, and I suspect also her husband Ray, old friends of mine from, goodness gracious, about 25 years ago. And they write, "Unfortunately, we couldn't join this till about 7:35 p.m. Eastern Time. So you may have mentioned Francis Schaeffer, and if not, where would he fit into this discussion?" I'm going to just try to handle that one quickly myself.
Okay.
Doris Ray is very much a disciple of Francis Schaeffer. I was actually about to say early on in the program that if I can think of anything that is very, very similar to the Center for Western Studies, it would be Schaeffer's L'Abri in Switzerland and the various L'Abris elsewhere that have been patterned after that. That's the vision. That's the heart, the spirit of the Center for Western Studies. Francis Schaeffer is kind of lurking just around the corner in pretty much everything that goes on in the center. All right, now I'm gonna just say right now that we are not going to get into what was supposed to be the main topic tonight. Instead, John, I need you to come back and be my guest another time. There are actually a couple of Tuesdays in June that I don't have filled yet. The first
Oh,
one is June 22nd, and the second is June 29th. So I'm going to try to arrange for you to come back on one or the other of those two Tuesdays, and we'll do that. But meanwhile, I do want us to really quickly look at just two more of the titles that you have students read in their
okay.
gap year. One is Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which I consider to be one of the greatest, most important uh, books of political theory, of political philosophy in all time. Tell us about that. Why have students read that when, after all, it comes from about 250 years ago, 240 years ago?
Right, right. Well, in a nutshell, I'll tell you why I chose it. I don't teach it. I know it and I love it, but I have a brilliant professor who teaches that for us. And I'll tell you why it is I asked him to come in and teach it. Because I think that the modern world is influenced by two views that people like Russell Kirk and T.S. Eliot and others called and got from Burke, the idea of a moral imagination and an idyllic imagination. And the moral imagination is embodied in Burke, in his understanding of a Christian approach to who human beings are, that we're fallen and that that sin is an internal problem. The alternative to that, and one that is extremely influential in our day still today, is this idyllic imagination. And it was born, I think, in Rousseau. Well, you say it's born in the Bible, but I mean Rousseau is an embodiment of this. And Burke understood. I mean, Rousseau, was basically the father of the French Revolution, and Burke's book is against the French Revolution.
Right.
What he's really against is the whole mindset, this idyllic imagination that influenced the French revolutionaries. And I think it's deeply ingrained in our culture today, even in our woke culture now. And so it's essential that when we study the Enlightenment, we read Burke and we read Rousseau, so they see those two ideas.
Yeah, I can hardly think of a book that would better prepare people to understand this woke, progressive, critical theory movement that is going on around us today. Burke's ideas are perennial in understanding, and I just think that students reading the Reflections on the Revolution in France would be very well equipped to understand the world around them right now. Many historians really attribute the fact that Great Britain did not go through a revolution like the French Revolution to two
Yes.
influences. One was the preaching of John Wesley and the tremendous revival that brought all over England, Scotland, and Wales. The other is Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Well, last one of the readings that I want to mention, and there are a whole lot more readings that we're not even going into tonight. You have your students read Marx and Engels's Communist Manifesto. Uh, Clearly, you're not just having them read quick and easy stuff. You're not just having them read stuff that reaffirms their Christian commitments or their uh, liberal in the old classical sense of that term, their commitment to liberty and to freedom of speech and private property rights and things like that. Why do you have them read the Communist Manifesto?
Well, Marx is extremely influential still today, even though so many of the Marxist regimes have fallen in the last 100 years, we still see a cultural Marxism that it's taking its tip from the Communist Manifesto. I think Marx in the manifesto is taking Rousseau and applying him in ways that make the world a materialist world, and then turn the classes of against each other in order to bring about a revolution. And I see that same thing happening today in other kinds of competitions, taking men and pitting them against women, or blacks against whites, or non-Americans versus Americans, and so on. There are all sorts of ways that economic conflict can be brought to the culture and used as a kind of cudgel or a pry bar to undo Western civilization. So Marx is an extremely important person to read, to know, and to spot when you find him in other ways and other flavors. So that's why we want to read him.
Yeah, it's rather disconcerting, rather troubling to find in the Communist Manifesto a list of various things that Marx and Engels thought should be achieved in the society that they envisioned, and to discover that a whole lot of those things are exactly what we have and have had for the last, in some cases, 100 years or more in America.
That's right.
Free compulsory education organized by the state, all sorts of different things, minimum wage law, and so on. Most people don't know that these ideas originated with Marx, or clear back in the time of Plato with his Republic, where some of these same ideas also rose. We really need to be aware of such influences in the world around us. Folks, we've been talking this evening with my good friend John Hodges, the director of the Center for Western Studies, and it's just it's very frustrating to me that we can't get through everything that I had hoped, but we're going to have John back on at a later time. One last thing about the academic year for students at the Center for Western Studies is that they make a trip to Europe. John, just tell us briefly, why do they do that? How does it contribute to their education?
Well, we wish we could go every year, because the last 2 years we haven't been able to go because of this virus, But every year for the last 13 in our history, we have taken our students to London and to Paris, and we rent an apartment in each of those cities, and we live there for a week or 10 days in each place, in order that they might be able to go and see firsthand a lot of the art and the concerts and the plays and the architecture and the ideas, the places that these ideas came from. I think you've got a few pictures here from our website. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner, that's some of the Elgin marbles from the British Museum. Those are from the Parthenon in Greece. And so we talk about the Parthenon. We know what the statues are about and so on. They get to actually see some real Parthenon statues. You see some rose window from the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris there. That's one of the most wonderful late Gothic buildings, built to house the crown of thorns. On the far right, you see myself and several of our students at the Eagle and Child in Oxford, where the Inklings used to meet and talk, Tolkien and Lewis and Owens and all those people. You'll see that's across the Eiffel Tower, and you see St. Paul's Cathedral in London from the Millennium Bridge. The gardens on the far right is Versailles Palace. We take them to Versailles. The students are seated on a bench. They're looking at the east end of Notre Dame Cathedral. There you see Notre Dame before the fire. We were there in Paris, by the way, when it was burning.
You didn't set it, by the way, right?
I'm sorry. Yes, we didn't set it. No, I think I can go on record as saying we didn't. Um, the there's just I don't know why we had that picture in there, but on the far left there you see it says Le Fantôme de l'Opéra. You see that? That's Box 5 at the Opera House in Paris, where they always leave it open for the Phantom to come. That's where the Phantom of the Opera came from. You see the stage at the Globe Theater there, the rebuilt Globe Theater. The north rose window of Notre Dame, Paris. What else do you see there? Well, you get the idea. That's a Marc Chagall ceiling of the Opera House in Paris, the famous Garnier Opera House. All of those are just a scattering of the places that we go. We take them to the Louvre Museum, we take them to the National Gallery, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, to the Musée du Moyen Âge, the Cluny Museum, the Middle Ages Museum in Paris. We take them to Oxford, as I said. We take them to Chartres Cathedral and the city of Chartres outside of Paris. Versailles, I mentioned. There's a whole lot of things that they need to see to fill in directly the things that we've talked about during the year. I'm particularly interested in the Middle Ages, where I think it is that the Christian faith and the world are of human thought are more closely held. The work of Augustine at the beginning of the Middle Ages, the work of Thomas Aquinas at the end of the Middle Ages, in dealing with Plato and Aristotle in particular, really brought about a medieval synthesis that took seriously the spiritual lives of the people at the time. And what we have from the Renaissance onward is a slow degrading of that appreciation of the spiritual nature of human beings and culture. And so it's good for them to be able to see Paris, because that's really the center of the medieval world, the University of Paris, and then of course Oxford and Cambridge in England. So we take them to all those places, and we hope to give them a better understanding firsthand of some of their own history.
Yeah, it's an amazing trip. My wife went with the group that included our daughter, Grace, about 6 years ago or so, 7 years ago. And it was a tremendous time. In fact, my wife has told people that our daughter got more out of her 1 year at the Center for Western Studies than my wife got out of her 4 years at Hillsdale College back in the 1970s. So it's really, it's quite an amazing thing. And I'm going to be shamelessly other promoting here, John, for a moment. I just would love to see the center have as many students as it can handle every single year. And so I want you to mention, I think this is truly extraordinary. I want you to mention, what is the cost per student per year?
Okay.
I think it's really amazing that you can do it for this.
We charge it's less than 15,000 for the year per student, and that includes all of the traveling that we do. We go to L'Abri, for example. We go to the Rochester branch of L'Abri, and we go in the spring, of course, to Europe, and all the travel expenses in between, and the tickets where we go to symphony concerts and all those things are all covered. So it's part of the tuition. The only thing they have to buy in addition is their books,
which of course they're going to keep with them for the rest of their lives and mark up and refer to again and again. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I am going to arrange to get you back with us so that we can actually go into what was intended to be our main topic this evening, and that was discussing the social justice, the woke, the progressive, the critical movement, critical race theory, critical legal theory, critical theory in general. This is something that I think the Lord has given you some very significant insights into, and it's something that we all need to be prepared to confront and respond to in a thoughtful Christian way, so as to take captive those thoughts to the obedience of Christ. So again, John, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. Next
can
week,
I
by the
plug?
way, our guest on From the Stacks will be Duggan Flanagan, a friend of mine who works with the for the Committee for a Constructive Alternative, CFACT. Duggan and I will be discussing his recent article called EPA's Totalitarian Assault on America. Duggan's a fascinating fellow, just as John is, a fellow with a lot of musical background and political activity and so on. Really, really great guy to have on. So he will be with us next week. Meanwhile, I do want to remind you that through the month of June, we will be glad to send a free copy of the wonderful new book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth by Jim Hollingsworth. This is very short chapters, typically 2 to 3 pages apiece, on a wide variety of different subjects. It's something that anybody with, say, a 10th grade education and above can understand. And if they will master the basic ideas in these 48 chapters, they will be well prepared to understand the myths and the truths of everything about climate change and climate and energy policy. We will send this as our way of saying thank you when you give a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-06 or the title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, and we will be glad to send you a free copy of this new and I think really helpful book, a very simple and direct book. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Look forward to seeing you next week. And meanwhile, God bless, go with him, live by faith, walk by faith, and love your neighbor as yourself.